Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. This is part of our weekly legislative series where we interview our center directors about what's happening in Olympia, what kind of legislation they're examining, and what direction we're headed with lawmakers and the governor. We get into all that detail with you, and we want to keep this an interactive process. If at any point during any of our conversations you have a question, just pop it into the Q&A box there in your Zoom, and we'd be happy to get that question asked and answered for you anytime. Some people put it in the chat. If you can't find the Q&A box, that happens sometimes. I'll try to watch for that, but it's a lot easier for tracking purposes and for myself as a moderator if you keep them all in the Q&A box. And then for those of you who might have to bow out early or miss something or want to hear something repeated, we do upload these videos to the Washington Policy Center YouTube channel usually within 24 hours of the episode. And then during the legislative session, we come here every week. After the legislative session is over, we usually do these every other week. So you can watch for that as well. So today we have a very packed program. We'll hear from Elizabeth Hovde. She is our Center for Healthcare Director and our Center for Worker Rights Director. We'll also hear from Pam Lewison, our Center for Agriculture Director. But we're going to start with our Center for Education Director, Liv Finne. Liv will be joining us here. And let's start this conversation with, you mentioned that a superintendent of public instruction, Reichdahl, who in January laid out a case for the media that public education funding in Washington State was in the decline. And you had, coincidentally, actually, you had a publication coming out with various charts showing the actual expenditures of public education. And we put out a challenge to people saying, which presents a more accurate picture? Is it fair to say that education spending is in decline? 97% of the respondents said no. And ordinarily I'd say, well, that's just a bias sample. But really, if you look at the actual numbers, it's just one of those things that's so ridiculous. I can't tell how much of it's just by a sample versus how much of it is people looking at this and saying, okay, well, this is just nonsense. But now there's this narrative that schools may need to close in order to get more money. Tell us about that.
Yes, it's shocking, really. Truly, it is shocking to watch this narrative being played out, given the actual facts. So yesterday there was an article in the front page of the Seattle Times at the top of the fold with a title, State Schools Chief Warns of Finance Shortfalls. Finance shortfalls, when we have never given so much money to the public schools ever in our state history. The number now, the recent number just released, it's by the State Fiscal Office of Financial Management, reports that in this school year, we are spending on average $19,000 per student on average statewide. Seattle Public Schools, nearly $23,000 per student on average statewide. Yet, according to the superintendents in these school districts, all these schools are going to have to close and we don't have enough money. And by the way, the state budget is being formulated right now and we have to paint a picture of despair and darkness, and for me, it drives me nuts, of course, because I know how much money we've increased for the public schools, and the facts show very clearly we have dramatically increased public school spending, yet they never say thank you to the taxpayers for the extra money we've given them for the schools. They never say this enough, we're going to do better within our means. Now they're talking like property developers or property owners saying, our buildings are closed, we don't have enough customers. Well, why don't they start talking about why so many children have left the public schools? Let's talk about that. If they were really folk, go ahead.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to recall the superintendent saying that we shouldn't use the term learning loss when it comes to what students experienced when schools were closed for the better part of 2 years. And he has acknowledged some emotional damage and pain, but he was kind of in a denial of the learning loss was. So, the closure of schools, if there's two different messages there. If you're saying, well, there really wasn't any harm done long-term learning-wise with these school closures, but then you're saying, well, if we don't get more money, we're going to have these school closures. It seems like you're undermining your own argument that maybe you could close for, a quarter of the time and save some dough. But you and I, of course, know that the students get harmed that way.
Well, it is hard to spin a narrative that is so contrary to the facts, right? So it must be very hard to come up with these lines because you're right. On January 9th, the state superintendent had a State of the Schools announcement. You'll recall he talked for an hour. And one of the things he said to the assembled journalists there was, don't use the words pandemic learning loss. We are accelerating in recovery. Now, anybody who just understands the basic English is, if you're talking about recovery, that means you have something lost, right? So it's a double talk. It's just double talk. And, I've been following the bills that are going through the state legislature, and I can see that there's skepticism about this narrative within the halls of Olympia because he had a bill, superintendent had a bill, the superintendent of public instruction had a bill that to provide every child free meals in the schools. That bill is not going forward as he envisioned it. There's a bill to add mental health counselors for the schools. That bill is not moving forward either. Of course, there will be more funding given to the schools like there always is to adjust for inflation, to keep the schools whole, and the schools will get increased funding like they do every year. But I see real skepticism now from the budget writers in Olympia. And even if the bills that I've been hopeful for that would focus on students as opposed to the systems, even if those bills don't pass, at least I think our messaging on why don't we have individual tutoring for children to help them catch up from their pandemic learning loss? Why aren't we helping the public charter schools get equitable funding to help the low-income children whose parents have decided to send their kids to public charter schools? We keep bringing up at Washington Policy Center, what about the learning that the children are supposed to be doing in these schools? So I think that's having a beneficial impact on the thinking down in Olympia, because not every double talk statement is being accepted, swallowed hook, line, and sinker.
Well, that actually reminded me a couple of things there. One, you brought up, the request for more mental health counselors. I'm sure that was couched into the added mental issues arising from being socially isolated for so long.
Yes.
And despite numerous people saying, hey, this is bad for kids, or social isolation, there's
right.
That now it's turned to that. But you also pointed out in your recent, and I know we covered it when it came out, but in your recent 5 Charts publication, that that most of the people hired for schools are really close to half, I should say, rather than most. Really close to half of the people being hired to schools now are not teachers at all. So the employment has gone through the roof for public education, but the number of teachers, it's not teachers being hired, so to speak. So
that's true.
Part of that.
Well, that's true. As we give more money to the schools, the funding is diverted from the classroom to non-teaching positions, and that's true nationwide. We've increased public school spending. Tripled nationwide in the last 40 years, and all the data shows that the increase that the number of teachers per student has increased according to the population growing, but the number of non-teachers per student has grown much faster. And so the result in Washington State is that only 52% of the actual employees in the public school system are teachers, and the remainder are non-teachers. And if you look at a private school setting, it's more like 80 to 90% of the employees in the private schools are actually teaching. And often you hear of principals in the private schools actually taking a classroom. So that a lot more of the attention is focused on the classroom resources. But that's all budget talk, and it gets very in the weeds, and it doesn't move anybody's hearts. I mean, let's talk about educating children better, right? And funding the student, not the system, is what's catching fire in other states across the country. So there was a bill introduced in Washington State. I think we talked about this before, House Bill 1615, that would have given families $11,000 in an education savings account so they could pay for the cost of private school tuition That would be a fantastic bill. That has now been introduced and blocked in committee, but the idea is now live and well and being discussed among families as they see, there's so many disappointments in this session. Special needs families have gotten really angry and frustrated. I saw an email early this week. There was a bill to try to move more dollars. Actually, it was more about removing obstacles for families to get the free and appropriate education they're entitled to by federal law. And that bill has been gutted, and the special needs community is outraged. And that's just what else do you expect from a standardized system that forces everyone into it and doesn't let anyone out? I mean, so of course those families would have been really much better served if we had got that bill, House Bill 1615 passed, because that bill would have provided another $10,000 if you had a special needs child. That means that you could just leave. If you had a child with special needs and that bill had passed, you would get an education savings account with $21,000 to educate your child as you see fit. Now, I tell you, a parent with that kind of funding and with all the wonderful resources, private resources available in Washington State to educate your child at a better level, the results would be phenomenal for families. But
yeah, and as you point out, that's with the private resources now. But if all of a sudden there's this competition in the marketplace where people are trying to earn those dollars, there's all kinds of services that might pop up, and new teachers coming in, new education establishments coming in to help students. And so, sky's the limit as far as what the possibilities are. We don't even know how good the education system could be.
Exactly. And so there's a school called Hamlin Robinson School. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's on Rainier Avenue in South Seattle. And it serves kids with dyslexia. And it costs like $40,000 a year to go to. But if you had a child with dyslexia and you had an education savings account with $21,000, maybe you could figure out a way to pay the balance or get some kind of aid from the school to send your kid there. I mean, imagine what could happen. This is a school that teaches the cutting edge methods of teaching children how to read who have serious dyslexic problems. The public schools are incapable of absorbing new methodologies. They're stuck in the old way of doing things. We pass laws to require the districts to identify kids with dyslexia, but then they don't deliver actual therapies. And so if you were a family with a seriously dyslexic kid, you would be frustrated. And if you had the means, you would be pulling your kid out. And it seems to me that a caring state would give families with those kinds of challenges support and help so they could get their child educated. That should be the focus. But that's, we're getting there. We'll get there.
I mean, as I feel like I point this out every time you're on, and and I know you've pointed out year after year, but for many years we've had lots of schools. People know which schools are failing. They've known teachers that are failing. Yeah. And the solution is usually, or the solution presented is usually multi-year, so that one class after another class after another class, if students go through and have the same problems and have the same, failure.
Right.
And that leaves them stunted for the future. And then when it doesn't work, they just create a new plan, a new 4-year plan or 5-year plan or 10-year plan. Then the whole cycle goes through again. Whereas the system you're talking about would be parents see things aren't working, they're on to something else. Which is, it's like what I do with my cell phone. If I don't get reception in the areas I need, I pick a new provider. I just move on. Yeah, exactly.
You don't stay there and just take whatever crumbs you're given. You leave. You find a better situation for yourself. This is why it's so frustrating for families, especially after COVID, because a lot of kids have been left behind. A lot of kids are struggling. You hear about mental health problems in the schools. I wonder. I really wish there had been there would be a survey to ask the question: do you think your mental health problems are at all related to the fact that you feel that you're behind in school? They never talk about that. But I really think there are a lot of kids that know they're behind, and their parents know they're behind. We should be helping them. And here we have a state legislature that has billions of dollars and finds extra pots of money every day. And they don't focus on the harm that was done to students during COVID. This is the greatest disappointment of this legislative session.
Real quick question from the audience. Idri asks, have you ever created a document with superintendents and cabinet salaries and benefits? And then the cost for trips and conventions, and even some time out to separate from the districts so that they can do consulting work. They're going through a list here.
Yeah. Well, I recently shared on Twitter, if you go to the fiscal.wa.gov website and you scroll down the page, you can find the K-12 schools section of that website, and it has a whole link that takes you to school salaries, and it takes and when you go to that link, at the you'll see the highest paid people in the Washington Public Schools, all these superintendents, and they're making over $400,000. Half a dozen people are making over $400,000 as superintendents in Washington Public Schools. And I mean, that's really getting out there in terms of a ridiculous salary for a district. You can get qualified people for half that money. You have to run districts. And so it's clear that the money is being diverted to self-interested people. If you had a competitive system, you wouldn't see that kind of distortion. And
I say this all the time, and it came up in the news recently. Todd Myers shared the story on Facebook with me because it actually came up in a government document recently. But the British comedy series Yes, Prime Minister covers this area very well when they're negotiating the civil service salaries and they're comparing themselves to the CEOs of, at the time, IBM and BP, British Petroleum. And then, but they do it in such a way as to hide it and then justify their salaries and benefits and stuff and talk about how competitive it is. And then, they come along and correct it. But it is frustrating. Real quick, there's one more question for you from Mark. What are the key dates for bills to die in committee? What are you looking at?
Well, there was a key date this past Friday where bills had to move out of fiscal committee to be moved to the next step of the process. So that was a key date on Friday. So there are no new bills being introduced as of Monday this week. So now what's happening is bills are being moved, that those bills that survived are going to be considered for a vote either in the Senate or in the House. And we go from there. So that's what we're looking at. There are other deadlines then later in this, in the month that require consideration of bills by either house in order to be moved. I don't have them right at my fingertips, but we're past two major deadlines and there are no new bills being introduced. So we're now looking at the bills that have passed out of committee into the consideration of the respective houses.
The interesting thing for people to remember, though, is the legislature is kind of like the Walking Dead in terms of, even when things die, you just never know when they can pop back up. They've got they got a special trick for everything. If it's something that they really, really, really want, that's right. The big question.
Right.
Liv, appreciate the work that you're doing there, and I know it's frustrating, but it's hard to keep a good idea down forever. That's the thing to remember.
Yes.
So keep plugging away. Yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Okay.
Thanks, Liv.
Bye.
All right, and be sure to check out Liv's posting, almost on a daily basis at WashingtonPolicy.org, our blog there, and you can check that out and keep up to date there, and be sure to share that information as well with parents and grandparents that that are watching these things. Let's turn to Pam Lewison, our Center for Agriculture Director. Pam, I saw you wrote a blog. Hey, it's time for gray wolf management. There was a plan I know that you were particularly happy with. And for people on the west side, maybe wolves seem far, far away. But on the east side, it is a very, very, very big deal. And, when it comes to agriculture and ranching, that's a big part of the state's economy, whether you know it or not on the west side. So this new gray wolf management plan was kind of exciting for people because in our state, there was some pretty success. There have been some big successes in reintroducing and growing the population of gray wolves. So, what possible harm could come from better management there? What happened?
So as a background for folks, right now we currently, last report I believe was 206 gray wolves in Washington State in 19 breeding pairs, or baby packs essentially, with more than a third of them centered in the northeast counties of the state. So Stevens, Pend Oreille counties, and spreading a little bit into the Okanagan and some of those other areas in the northeast part of the state. The bill would have declared wolves, which are federally delisted as a protected species, in that far eastern third of the state. It would have brought the state in agreement with the federal government, declaring them to be recovered in that portion of the state. And then counties that are most affected by gray wolves would have the opportunity to develop management plans around compensation for ranchers who lose livestock to wolf kills, the ability to hire more range riders to help deter wolves, and do all of those sort of non-lethal things first, but also give local counties the control and the option to quickly dispatch wolves that are habitual eaters of livestock, because it means they're not afraid to come in and be in a yard. And in fact, there are reports from folks up that way of gray wolves walking through their yards with their children playing in the backyard. So
I tell you, if people, when you see a wolf on TV, they look really awesome and they look cool and all that. And you see them at the zoo. The zoo wolves I've seen are pretty small. I was predator calling out in when I was hunting out in Okanagan, and I got a wolf to run up within about 10 feet of me. And let me tell you, if you've never seen a wild wolf up close, they are just enormous. I mean, it is just huge. I've seen bears up close and they didn't look as big as the wolf. So it was really something to see, and the thought of these creatures walking through your yard with your kids would be very, very, very problematic.
Right. I think for folks up there, it's terrifying, because like you said, they're massive predatory animals. And I think, that's kind of the basis of that bill. Then the Department of Fish and Wildlife killed it in fiscal committee. They attached a $3.2 million price tag with 7 full-time employees needing to be hired.
Wait, 7 government employees hired to oversee this project?
Yeah, even though what it's supposed to be is a series of mutual agreements of understanding between the counties and Department of Fish and Wildlife about how counties will take care of this management program on their own. So it sort of died the death of 1,000 paper cuts by form of a very costly operating fiscal note attached to it that truly wasn't necessary.
That's fascinating to me because I've never, I know the problem could happen, but I haven't come across it before where the fiscal note is exaggerating, the expense, and it makes me wonder, what's the appeal on that? Unless if you're the bill sponsor and you're looking at this going, wait a second, this was a voluntary memorandum of understanding. The counties would be doing this themselves. How is it possible that we need all these state employees to oversee this thing? That I honestly, I don't know the process for that, or if there is.
No, I can't say that I know the process. I don't work for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, obviously, but I think really what it is we have a lot of folks within that community who truly don't understand that it is a pressing problem. And it is something that falls within the scope of our current wolf recovery and management plan, and just provides some flexibility and some relief from people who are quite literally having their livelihoods eaten in front of them.
Yeah.
because not only do wolves kill livestock to eat, but they also, just their presence alone, their scent, does things like causes cows that have been bred back to abort early. It causes cattle and sheep to have a lesser likelihood of being bred back to begin with. You often will have cows that drop and get eaten, and there's not a trace of them left because they're small. So wolves will eat every bit of it, and a ranger can't prove that that calf ever existed. So they are having their future taken from them without any kind of compensation.
Right. And keep in mind, if somebody's thinking, well, that's not my problem, that's your problem. Well, the wildlife is considered a benefit for everybody. And that's where the obligation to pay kicks in, because the wildlife is there for the public good.
Not only a benefit for everyone, but also, if you read the recovery plan, there are supposed to be wolves in every single county in this state. So it may not be your problem today, but it might be in a while.
It's gonna take a long while. I'm looking forward to Island County wolf populations and King County. There's some big areas in King County, but it wouldn't take long for wolves to go find some habitat that might have people thinking, there is a need to regulate these things. So let's turn toward the buffer bill. There was a lot of hope last time we talked. There was for the first time in a few years, the bill was looking solid. There was near universal tribal support. Farmers and ranchers in the ag industry were pleased with it, and basically everybody seemed to be pleased with it. Where is that now?
Everyone was pleased with it except the governor's office. So it had broad bipartisan support in both sponsorship and all of the additional sign-ons after. Virtually not quite a unanimous support in the tribal community, but very close. And the same in the ag community, almost universal acceptance and quite honestly delight over a bill that made riparian buffers a fully voluntary program with money to better facilitate people participating in that program. The only folks that were opposed were the governor's office, and the governor's office chose to stand firm in that opposition, and it killed the bill. So
that's tragic.
It is tragic. I think the justification they gave was that because there was no regulatory backstop in the bill, which is just a fancy way of saying we're going to punish you if it doesn't work to our standards, they were staunch in their belief that it should not move forward.
By the way, it's ironic coming from, just think about this, because some people will say, well, look, the governor's right there, because if it wasn't working to the point where you wanted to, you got to have these extra teeth in there. But I would point out that the governor set a number of standards for environmental progress on climate, for example, and none of them were achieved. Todd Myers laid that out. The governor got the great headlines, got to declare himself a green governor, and then when it was pointed out that we hadn't actually achieved any of these objectives, those objectives just disappeared from the website. So if the same principle were applied to the governors, hey, look, there's no regulatory backstop here. There's no teeth. We either achieve this or somebody's going down or something's going to change. It doesn't happen to their own stuff. It's only with these private property owners that are trying to make a living, and they seem to be willing to, go to the wall on that, but not their own actions. So,
well, I think what is most disappointing about it is that it's probably the first time that I can recall where we've had broad-based agreement about something that takes a holistic view about the interface between, say, fishing communities, agriculture, urban and ex-urban environments. Because, it's a collective process. And it was the first time since I was hired at WPC 40 years ago that I was actually able to testify in support of a piece of legislation that dealt directly with agriculture. So when you have that kind of push in a positive direction, to see it snuffed out by one person who just clearly does not care. It's really frustrating.
That would be, and from what I understand, a failure of the bill could open up the state to various lawsuits that could have a detrimental effect. And again, agriculture is a very big deal in Washington State, as are property rights and property values for people. So there could be some big lawsuits coming, and that could create a judicial fiat kind of situation that is more problematic for everybody involved. So sad. Yeah. Any final pieces of legislation you're watching for, or anything that we should take note of, Pam?
I think the one last thing I wanted to highlight was the Ag Overturn Bill. So Senate Bill 5476 would have created a self-determined 12-week, call it a harvest window for a good chunk of our agricultural community, not everyone, but most everyone, to identify a period of time where they would not have to pay time and a half until all of their employees eclipsed 50 hours. This is particularly important given that right now we're at a 48-hour overtime rule, and it will drop down to 40 next year. There were more than 1,000 people who signed up in support of that piece of legislation. What was particularly trying is there were state certified translators in the room for the hearing, but Senator Saldana took it upon herself to translate for people who were testifying remotely, and she gave summaries rather than verbatim interpretations of what our native Spanish-speaking farm worker community had to say. Aside from the ethics question about that, the bill didn't get a fair shot to begin with, because you had folks with no real understanding of that community and the nature of agricultural work, testifying, saying that farms should essentially be held to the same standard as the business community, as a white-collar community, and more specifically, that our overtime policy, previous to the Supreme Court ruling 2 years ago, was effectively rooted in Southern racism, despite the fact that even at that time period, the vast majority of farm workers in this country were not, in fact, migrant workers. They were local white employees, either of farms of their own or of neighboring farms.
That is, it is frustrating to see, because the harvest time is such a unique time. There's a different period, and then when you try to explain, I've seen this, and you've commented on this, where you're trying to explain, you have this select harvest time, and then there's slower times, and then you saw the legislative assumption that farmers are working half time, because there's these slower times. What's slower time for some workers? It's not necessarily a slow time for the guy who owns the farm, or the family that owns the farm, or the woman who owns the farm, because they've got a lot of prep work that goes into all of those seasons.
I think really what I tried to explain to people most often is that it's a symbiotic relationship. We need each other. Farms need farm workers to function properly, and farm workers need farms so they have somewhere to work. And if you do the math about what this all looks like, next year we'll be operating in about a $2 billion deficit. If every farm worker in Washington State gets paid 15 hours of overtime every week, so putting them back to where they should be in terms of their work shifts, our agricultural community will have a $2 billion deficit. I don't know about any other business, but $2 billion is something you can't lose year over year and continue to function.
The only thing I can think of that's even close is the federal government, because they can just keep printing money. It doesn't matter. But
if there's a literal printing press somewhere, I've got a spot for it in my shop.
There we go. There we go. Pam, thanks so much. We'll catch up with you, and hopefully some miracle will occur, and people will say, you know what, let's get something done for the east side and the agricultural sector of the state. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Nick.
You bet. And let's now turn to Elizabeth Hovde. She is our Center for Healthcare Director, also our Center for Worker Rights Director, but I think the healthcare hat is on today, in part because there's a resolution coming up. We'll be publishing an analysis of that soon, calling for, well, it's described as universal healthcare, but what that usually means is government-only healthcare in Washington State. What's the latest on that, Elizabeth?
Oh, well, there's a Senate Joint Memorial 8006 that is asking the federal government to create a universal healthcare program, otherwise known as socialized government-run healthcare. And if the government does not do that, they want it to make it easier for a state like Washington to do it with waivers and things like that can give it more money to do its own. So that's going on, and it's gotten a nod. It's moving forward. There's a lot of trouble with that bill, in my opinion, because it makes outlandish claims, I think, about what the problem with healthcare is, what is driving cost, what is the problem there. And it also, in doing the ASPE, is asking for something we don't necessarily want. We're seeing in other countries that universal healthcare programs, usually affordability and quality and access don't go together. And you're seeing that in Canada, Great Britain. Wait times are detrimental to the public.
Yeah, I feel like we're starting to see more and more of that here too. A lot of the hospitals, as we know, are in financial distress because they were shut down from so many procedures. We've got the third-party payer system that distorts pricing badly, so nobody knows what the cost is of anything. There's a lot of shifting going on, and hospitals are required to eat costs a lot of the time for a lot of patients. Many patients to the tune of just millions and millions of dollars. So there's some big stresses here on that. And it's interesting, too, how often people say, hey, I really want the universal government-only healthcare system because I want the government to run that. And yet they don't take a step back and think of all the other things government is running. I mean, for me, I look at, most recently I've looked at a spreadsheet showing how much the government, federal government is spending this year versus how much revenue the government is taking in. And you have a difference of over $1 trillion. And then you look at the categories of the expenditure and you ask, where would you cut to make up for the extra expenditure? And all of it is politically difficult. But so it's not going to happen right away, but eventually it has to, because, eventually you can't, you can't do that to your monetary system. So, you look at that and you think, would you really want to put your health care in the hands of that organization where they're going to be able to decide, gosh, that person is over 60. I'm not so sure their healthcare needs should be top priority. We need some way of determining their value, to us.
Yeah, so. Patient-centered healthcare always loses out, right? There's never going to be enough to cover all the needs, and the government has not shown a good pattern of making priority-based budgeting, at least here in Washington. So I think a lot of people think it sounds good until they really look at it and really see that they lose even more control over their healthcare and over their healthcare dollars.
Yeah, and the places where they have reached a point where they thought they were going to implement this at the state level, people, polls have shown people get really excited about this idea because, hey, I know it's complicated, it's difficult to go in, you don't know what anything costs, insurance is always a pain, you're waiting on hold for 2 hours while you're trying to figure out what a bill means, and then you're lucky if you get the answer or you have to call some other department. And if it sounds like this recently happened to me, you are correct, and it's annoying. But then when they do the follow-up and start talking about, less access, less coverage, for older people, it's when you've got universal health care in name, But when it comes to actually accessing the healthcare, you've got some universal wait times and rationing, and that's what makes people say, hold on, I'm not so sure about this. And then they add in the cost factor of the new taxes you'd have to pay to actually cover it. And then people say, hold on, I might not like the current system, but I definitely don't want that replacing it. That's
you're exactly right. I think, when you start adding in what is going to be covered, what's not, what the premiums are versus the new higher taxes, you start losing support really quickly.
Let's turn to some positive news for you, and that's the Nurse Licensure Compact. So far today, we've talked about a lot of things that have died. One of the things you've been pointing to is, hey, we have this opportunity to make things, make a reform that happened under the COVID period. We have an opportunity to make that reform permanent and actually improve things. Tell us about what's happening with that.
So there are two bills moving along to join the Nurse Licensure Compact, which would allow nurses from other states to work here, our nurses to work over state lines when there's need for nurses in a location or in a medical facility. And so it would help this nursing shortage in some cases. There was a bill moving in the House. It has died. There was a bill moving in the Senate, and it is going forward. And it's a great bill. It is just another tool in the toolbox that we need hospitals and medical facilities to have to meet patient needs in Washington State. And it's interesting because, on the one hand, you hear the nurses union and other labor organizations talking about staggering shortages, making everyone burned out, and it's unsafe for patients. And then they're given this opportunity to grab a tool that can offer some help in that situation sometimes, and they don't want it. Some of them don't want it. A lot of nurses do want it. A lot of military nurses who are here and unable to work because their license is from another state and they haven't gotten their license here yet, they want it. So the Senate bill is still moving, and we're going to cross our fingers for it.
That's good news. There's a question that's come in from Bill. It says, how do we address the fact that medical bankruptcy is a leading bankruptcy cause in these United States? Hovde is citing UK and Canada as examples of the other mode of healthcare when those countries' systems are dominated by big pharma. You should cite Germany, Finland, Sweden, etc. Any response to that?
Well, my response would be that more competition and more knowledge among consumers could bring down our healthcare costs. We definitely need to contain the costs, and every regulation we are adding to healthcare in this not government, not private, not free market system is adding to the cost of care. And I think if you free it, if you give people more control over their healthcare dollars, you'll see costs go down.
Yeah, there's lots of different, there's lots of distinctions here, but I mean, I've used this story a number of times. There's a legislator, Senator Phil Fortunato, had a medical procedure coming up. This is several years ago when I was talking to him, and the first estimate he got, because he wanted to pay for it, was like somewhere close to $35,000-$40,000. It was incredibly expensive. And he kept calling around. And as the week or two progressed where he was making all these calls, most of the time they said, I don't know what the cost is. We'll have to get back to you. So then when they did get back to him, he eventually found a place where they were doing these surgeries on a specific day. So they had all the staffing and everything was there. They had a gap in the room where they would be able to do another one of these things. They were able to plan it out, and it went from $40,000 to $8,000. So if he'd have just gone with insurance, he would have had this $40,000+ expense, but he ends up paying for it, and it's $8,000. So the gap there is just huge. So there's all kinds of market-based kind of market pricing information that is not reaching people or companies or others to change those, to put pressure on those prices. That's why when you hear about price reductions, it's usually about subsidies or mandates, and it misses out on the opportunity of the free marketplace, which is there's information that leads to competition and competing products even and services that end up reducing costs. People make fun of it, and you see that, especially culturally. You'll see people will kind of mock the idea of added market-based reforms in healthcare or other services like that. But when you think about it, it has happened. But I think LASIK eye surgery has been largely, was for a long time, was pretty much private sector. You're paying for it if you want it. Now there's more insurance involved. But, what did the cost go from, several $1,000s an eye, I think, to what it is today, which is dramatically lower. So,
Great.
Sorry.
No, it's a great story, the Fortunato one, and it plays down to lower cost things too, like my kids' eye care, right? I paid less out of pocket with no insurance involved than I would have with insurance. So this plays out everywhere, and I think that one of the biggest things we need to look at is educating consumers, price transparency for consumers to be good shoppers. Healthcare is not a right. Healthcare is a need, and we need to look at it that way. Housing is a need, food is a need, healthcare is too. We shop for housing and food, and we can shop for healthcare. We need to give people information, make sure price transparency is out there, and let competition and innovation help us with cost containment of healthcare.
Before I let you go, real quickly, there's been several new studies out indicating that people who've had COVID have a strong immune response to that, which is in some cases is greater than that of the vaccines. And obviously we also have learned that when people get a vaccination, you can still contract the disease or the variants of it, and that means you can also spread it to other people, even though the severity in your case is likely to be lower. But all of this leads to the idea that a vaccination mandate on people for employment purposes under the name of being safe or keeping other people safe, it does not make sense, and it doesn't follow the science there. So I take it the state has decided to rehire the people that it fired because of their refusal to go along with the mandate.
So cute, Dave. Those bills, any bills helping former workers who were fired because of the vaccine mandate, or they resigned or went away for whatever reason because of the mandate, those bills are not moving forward. The one I really wanted and hoped for was one that just had to do with the vaccine mandate now. Fine, let's stop looking at the past. Let's let people excuse their past behavior however they want to, when there's more and more proof in the pudding that people who can, all that. But 1801 would have stopped the vaccine mandate on new employees hired for some state employment. So I was hopeful for that one. It did not get a hearing. It was filed pretty late. But that's where I think we need to go. If we don't want to rehash, if we don't want to worry about litigation and all these things, because Governor Inslee's mandate is outdated. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't make sense, especially when you're not requiring a booster, but you're saying you don't have any immunity then from the past vaccine. It needs to end. So let's look forward. Let's end the vaccine mandate on future employment. And I was hoping to get some discussion around that idea in this legislative session, and it didn't happen.
Yeah, it's frustrating because I see that as more politically dominated. And look, I was jabbed. Can't remember now. I think it was three times, or the double update or whatever. But I've got plenty of people I know who opted not to, and I feel like there was all this effort on demonizing them, and but yet we claim we're going to follow the science, and now you point to it and say, well, there is no reason to fire these people. There's no reason to disrupt their livelihood, to get rid of their retirement, to disrupt their families that way, and their schooling of their children and everything else. And the reaction of this seems to be more of a red state, blue state. Let's point to them and declare that they're part of the boogeymen of the right. Keep in mind, also, there's been essentially one-party rule of the executive for 40 years in Washington State. So the whole idea of blaming, the boogeyman of the right is kind of funny if you think of political parties as left versus right, because it just doesn't happen here. But it's sad to see these people kind of left out to dry, and then no change. This immobility, the fossilization of this attitude setting in, instead of looking at it like, okay, well, we're through the worst of it. Let's take a look at what we need to change now. I don't think anyone would hold it
I hear from several of these former employees who, frankly, there's lawsuits going on behind the scenes here. I don't think this is going to be a cheap thing for our state. I think we're going to either be spending money making it up to people we mistreated, or just defending the mistreatment. This is going to cost us. And it's heartbreaking to hear from these people. They've lost their careers because they didn't get the shot, that they're constantly told now, finally, that, oh yeah, you're right, you can spread and contract the disease whether you're unvaccinated or vaccinated. So it's just heartbreaking.
And many of these people were putting themselves at risk when there was no vaccine and the disease was at its worst. Many of them were first responders and doing these jobs for public safety and other things. And then suddenly, after being told, hey, you're a hero for doing that, P.S., you're fired because you're a psycho loser for not going along with this mandate. That seems wrong to me, and it's a wrong that should be remedied. But that's a subject for another day, I'm sure. Elizabeth, thanks so much for making the time again today for Washington Policy on the Go. And folks, you can check out her latest work as well as that of Pam Lewison, our Center for Agriculture Director, and Liv Finne, our Center for Education Director, at our blog at washingtonpolicy.org. Catch it for the latest. Also sign up for our email updates. If you know somebody who's focused on state government, interested in state government, state policy, and local news about what's happening in Olympia, be sure that they sign up for our free Friday newsletter. You just go anywhere, basically on our blog or on our main homepage. There's a sign-up section there. You can see it. Pops up all over the place. Sign up for that Friday newsletter. It's free, and you'll get the information that you need to know about what's happening here in Washington State. This is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center, and we'll see you next week.